Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be kind of time traveling
Oh,
through all
smart.
the changes in how India runs its elections. It's
Great topic.
definitely a must-know if you're, studying for the UPSC exams.
Absolutely.
But honestly, it's fascinating for anyone who votes, right?
You're so right. We're talking over 15 committees and commissions, all dedicated to making elections in India as fair as they can be. It's a huge deal and shows how much the country cares about democracy.
15. That's a lot of people working to make sure every vote counts.
Mhm.
So how do we even, start to break down all these changes, all these reforms?
Well, a good way to think about it is by looking at the different periods of change. We've got all the reforms that happened before 1996, which was a huge year for election changes, and then everything that came after, especially after 2010.
Okay, so it's like we're doing electoral archaeology, digging through different layers of history.
Exactly.
Let's start with those early wins before 1996. What were some of the big moves back then?
Well, one that really stands out is when they lowered the voting age to 18 back in 1988. It wasn't just about, changing a number. It was about giving a whole generation a voice, letting them shape the future of their country.
Right. Imagine how the balance of power shifted when all these young people could suddenly vote. Like, certain issues probably became way more important to politicians. Did this reform face any pushback at the time?
Oh, of course, every big change does. But the idea that young adults, people who are directly affected by government policies, should get to choose their leaders, that gained a lot of support.
It's kind of cool to see how India was ahead of the curve on that. Lots of other countries followed suit later on and lowered their voting ages too. What other big reforms happened before 96?
Another really important one was giving more power to the Election Commission, the group that runs the elections, especially over the people working those elections. It helped make things fairer and, harder for anyone to try and manipulate the results.
So it's not just about the voters, but also about setting higher standards for everyone involved in running the elections. What about technology? Were there any big advancements during that time?
Oh, for sure. In 1989, India made a giant leap by bringing in electronic voting machines.
EVMs.
Yeah, it was a game changer. No more paper ballots, which meant way less tampering and a much faster counting process.
It's amazing to think that EVMs, which we just kind of take for granted now, were actually a cutting-edge solution to real problems back then.
Yeah.
So you mentioned 1996 was like this pivotal year. What exactly happened then?
Well, 1996 was when the Dinesh Goswami Committee, which had been studying electoral reforms for a while, finally presented its recommendations.
Yeah.
And you know what? They were actually implemented. So a whole wave of new changes just swept in. This is a perfect example of how these committees can really make a difference and why they're so important for anyone studying for the UPSC to understand.
Yeah, for those prepping for the UPSC, this would be a key thing to study, right?
Absolutely.
Not just the name of the committee, but like the whole context.
Yeah.
What was happening at the time? What did they suggest? And did their suggestions actually work?
Exactly. You got to connect the dots. The Dinesh Goswami Committee, they were formed back in 1990. So understanding what was going on in the country back then, the problems with elections, and how their recommendations aim to fix those, that's the kind of analysis that'll help you ace that exam.
Okay, so Dinesh Goswami Committee, 1996, big changes. What did these changes actually look like for the everyday voter? What would they have noticed?
Well, one thing that probably resonated with a lot of people was that they banned selling alcohol near polling stations,
Oh, interesting.
No more election day shenanigans fueled by, let's just say, liquid courage. It was a step toward making the atmosphere a bit more serious, more focused on this important civic duty.
I can picture that. It really shows how the committee wanted people to make their choices based on reason, not because they were, under the influence.
Yeah.
Were there any other steps taken to prevent that kind of influence?
Oh, yeah. They also made it mandatory for candidates to tell everyone about any criminal history they might have. This was huge for transparency, giving voters the info they needed to make informed decisions.
Transparency and informed decisions, that's what makes a democracy work. Did the Dinesh Goswami Committee tackle anything else?
They did. Another big recommendation was to stop candidates from running in more than two constituencies at the same time. This was about preventing vote splitting and making sure that those who got elected could really focus on serving the people who voted for them.
So it was about making them commit to one place and not spreading themselves too thin, right? It seems like a lot of this was about closing loopholes and making the system fairer.
Exactly. Every reform, every little change was aimed at refining the system, making it tougher to manipulate. And the years after 1996, India just kept going down this path, fixing problems and pushing for even more transparency.
Perfect. So what happened in the post-1996 era? What were some of the big focus areas?
Well, one big area was making sure everyone could vote, no matter their situation. For example, to make sure people like military personnel, who might be stationed far from home, didn't lose their right to vote, the government started using postal ballots.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, it was a way to adapt the system to different needs and make sure more people could participate.
Right, so electoral reforms aren't just about fixing what's broken, but also about making sure everyone has a voice, no matter what their circumstances are. Did this focus on transparency continue after 96?
Definitely. Financial transparency became a big deal. From then on, anyone running for office had to declare all their assets and liabilities. It shed light on their financial dealings, helped fight corruption, and made sure they were accountable to the voters.
Wow. Transparency in finances, that's huge for building trust between the people and their elected officials. Were there any other notable changes during this time?
Oh, yeah. A big one was the change to an open ballot system for Rajya Sabha elections. Now, for those who might not know, the Rajya Sabha is the upper house of India's parliament, and its members are chosen by the people in state legislative assemblies.
Okay, so how did changing to an open ballot system change things?
Big time. Before, these votes were secret. But with the open ballot, each MLA has to publicly say who they're voting for.
Interesting.
This was done to try and lessen the influence of, bribes and pressure in these elections, made the process much more transparent, and hopefully cut down on shady backroom deals.
Like shining a spotlight on everything so everyone can see what's happening and maybe be less likely to do something sneaky?
Fascinating. Now, I'm dying to hear about the reforms of the 21st century. What were those like?
Ah, the 21st century, eh? Well, it brought a whole new set of challenges and, of course, new opportunities. And India's electoral system has kept up, adapting, and evolving. But we'll dive into those exciting developments after a short break. Oh, come on. You're leaving us hanging. But all right, we'll be right back to explore the latest chapter in India's journey toward making its elections better and better. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before the break, we were talking about how India has been constantly fine-tuning its election process, like making sure all the parts work together for a real democracy.
It's true. It's like they've been working on this big, complex machine, making sure all the gears are meshing smoothly.
That's a great way to put it. So let's jump into the 21st century. What new challenges popped up, and how did India's electoral system adapt?
Well, one of the biggest changes in this era is the growing role of technology. We talked about EVMs earlier, but in the 21st century, they got a serious upgrade with something called VVPAT.
VVPAT?
Yeah, it stands for Voter Verifiable Paper Audit Trail.
Okay, that sounds pretty intense. What is it, and why was it such a big deal?
Basically, it adds another layer of security and transparency to every single vote. With VVPAT, when someone votes electronically, the machine prints out a little paper slip showing who they voted for. The voter can see it for a few seconds to make sure it's right, and then it drops into a sealed box. So if there's ever a question, there's a physical record they can check.
Ah, so it's like a receipt for your vote.
Yeah.
You can see that your vote was recorded correctly, and there's a paper trail in case anyone needs to verify anything, like a double-check system to make sure everything is accurate.
Exactly. It addressed a lot of concerns about potential tampering with EVMs and really helped build trust in the system. It was a huge step towards making sure that every single vote is counted and counted correctly.
It's amazing to see how technology is being used to actually strengthen democracy. What other big reforms came about in the 21st century?
Well, remember how we talked about inclusivity earlier? In 2010, India took another big step in that direction by giving voting rights to NRIs, non-resident Indians.
Wow, that's a major change. So even if you're an Indian citizen living in another country, you can still vote in Indian elections.
Exactly. It recognizes that citizenship doesn't just disappear because someone lives abroad. They still have a connection to India and care about what happens there.
Makes sense. So it's about making sure all Indian citizens, wherever they are, have a chance to shape their country's future. Were there any other reforms that focused on giving voters more power?
Absolutely. To give voters even more say, they introduced something called the none of the above option, or NOTA for short. Think of it like a built-in protest vote.
Oh, that's interesting. So if none of the candidates on the ballot seem good, you can choose NOTA to say, hey, none of these people represent me.
Exactly. It gives voters a way to express their dissatisfaction with the choices and puts pressure on political parties to offer better candidates. It's a powerful statement about voter agency.
NOTA. That's a really interesting addition to the Indian electoral system. It seems like the 21st century has been all about fine-tuning the system, making sure it's more inclusive and technologically advanced and giving voters more power. But how have these reforms impacted the UPSC exam itself? Like, what should aspirants be paying attention to?
Oh, for UPSC aspirants, these 21st century reforms are a gold mine. They're full of potential essay topics. Imagine analyzing the impact of NRI's voting or how effective NOTA has been in improving the quality of candidates. There's so much to explore, and understanding the nuances of these reforms is crucial for doing well on the exam.
So it's not just about memorizing names and dates, but about thinking critically about the impact of these reforms, right?
Absolutely. You need to understand the why behind these changes.
Right.
What were the challenges? What were the goals? And what have the long-term consequences been for Indian democracy?
It's about seeing the big picture, the story of how India is constantly striving to make its democracy better.
It's fascinating. Okay, so we've talked about reforms from committees and the government, but what about the courts? What role has the Supreme Court played in all of this?
The Supreme Court has been a major player, often pushing for reforms and setting ethical standards. One landmark judgment that all UPSC aspirants should know about is the Lily Thomas versus Union of India case back in 2013.
Okay, tell me more about that case. What was it about?
This case had to do with disqualifying lawmakers who were convicted of crimes. Before this judgment, if an MP or MLA was found guilty of a crime, they had 3 months to appeal the verdict and could stay in office during that time.
Wait, so even if they were found guilty, they could still hold their positions and potentially influence the legal process?
Exactly. And that was a big concern. But in the Lily Thomas case, the Supreme Court said, nope, that's not going to fly anymore. They ruled that any MP or MLA convicted of a crime with a sentence of 2 years or more would be disqualified immediately. No more grace period. Wow. That's a strong statement. It sends a clear message that no one is above the law, not even elected officials.
Absolutely. It was a major step towards cleaning up politics and making sure that those who represent the people are held to the highest standards. This judgment changed everything, and several sitting lawmakers ended up being disqualified because of it.
It really shows how the judiciary can step in and protect the integrity of elections, pushing for much-needed reforms. It's a fascinating example of the checks and balances within a democracy. Are there any other big Supreme Court judgments that UPSC aspirants should know about?
Oh, there are tons. The court has weighed in on everything from how campaigns are financed to the conduct of candidates. For UPSC aspirants, it's not enough to just know the names of these cases. You have to understand the reasoning behind them and their long-term impact.
So it's not just rote memorization, but deep analysis. What advice would you give to UPSC aspirants on how to tackle this massive topic of electoral reforms?
My best advice is to think of it like a detective story. Don't just try to memorize facts. Dig deeper. Figure out the context of each reform, the problems it was meant to solve, the debates surrounding it, and how it fits into the bigger story of Indian democracy.
It's about understanding the narrative, the journey of how India is trying to make its democracy the best it can be. What a fascinating conversation. But we're almost out of time. Before we go, can you give our listeners a preview of what's coming up in the final part of our deep dive?
In the next part, we're going to shift gears and look toward the future. We'll put on our futurist hats and imagine what the next chapter of electoral reforms in India might look like. What exciting innovations and changes might be on the horizon.
Now that's something to look forward to. Join us next time as we explore the potential future of elections in India.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent this whole time exploring how India's elections have changed, from the early days of, lowering the voting age, all the way to those high-tech VVPAT machines.
And those big Supreme Court decisions. Yeah. It's been amazing to see how India has worked to make its elections more inclusive, more transparent, more, solid.
Definitely. A real commitment to democracy.
Absolutely. But now, let's shift gears a bit. Let's look ahead. What does the future hold for electoral reforms in India? What kind of innovations and changes could we see down the road?
Well, one area that's ripe for disruption is technology. We've already seen how impactful EVMs and VVPATs have been. But imagine a future where we're using blockchain technology to protect voter data, making it, virtually tamper-proof.
Blockchain, like the tech behind Bitcoin and all that.
Yeah. It's famous for its security, how you can't really mess with the data. So picture this. Every vote is recorded on a blockchain, creating this permanent, transparent record. It could practically eliminate worries about vote rigging and really boost people's trust in the results.
That's fascinating. It's like bringing Fort Knox-level security to voting. Are there any other tech advancements that could revolutionize elections, you think?
Definitely. There's been a lot of buzz about online voting. Think about how convenient that would be, especially for NRIs and people with disabilities who might have trouble getting to polling stations.
Right. Online voting would definitely make it easier for a lot of people to participate. But wouldn't there be, like, huge security risks?
Of course, of course. Any talk about online voting has to deal with those risks head on. Hacking, voter privacy, it's all a big concern. It'd take incredibly strong cybersecurity measures and tons of testing before it could be rolled out on a large scale.
It's like walking a tightrope, right?
Yeah.
You want voting to be easy and accessible, but also super secure and, trustworthy. What about other areas beyond tech? Where else do you see room for improvement, for reform?
Well, campaign finance reform is a big one. We've talked about how money and power can influence elections. So how do we create a system that's more fair and doesn't favor the wealthy?
It's a tough question. How do you balance free speech with preventing rich donors from having too much sway?
Right. It's tricky. One idea is to look into models where the government helps fund elections, either partially or fully. That could reduce how much campaigns rely on private donations, which often come with, strings attached.
State funding, huh? That's a bold idea.
Yeah.
But how do you make sure that money is distributed fairly? And wouldn't there still be a risk of misuse?
Oh, for sure. Those are valid concerns. Any system with state funding would need strong checks and balances to prevent abuse. It would require meticulous planning and oversight to make sure it actually levels the playing field and doesn't create new opportunities for manipulation.
It's definitely a complex issue with no easy answers. But it's great that people are thinking about creative solutions like state funding to tackle this problem of money in politics.
Yeah.
What about other areas that need attention? Like, what about people who just don't vote? How do we get them re-engaged, especially if they've become disillusioned with the whole system?
That's a great point. Better civic education could be key. We need to teach people, especially young people, about why voting is important, how the government works, and how their vote can actually make a difference.
It's about instilling that sense of civic duty, helping them see that their voices matter, right?
Exactly. And making voting more convenient could help too, like having more early voting options or even trying weekend voting to fit busy schedules.
Those are really practical ideas that could make a big difference. It's all about removing obstacles and making it easier for people to participate in their democracy. So, before we wrap up this amazing deep dive, I have one final question. If you had a magic wand and could implement one electoral reform in India, what would it be?
Oh, wow. That's a tough one. So many possibilities. But if I had to choose just one, I think I'd focus on making the Election Commission of India even more independent and powerful.
The Election Commission, why that specifically?
Well, they're the guardians of our democracy, the ones who ensure elections are free and fair, giving them more control over their budget, protecting them from political pressure, and strengthening their overall capacity would boost their credibility and allow them to do their job without fear or favor.
It's about making sure the group responsible for keeping our elections honest has the power to do it right. That's a really powerful vision for the future of elections in India. So, as we wrap up this incredible exploration of electoral reforms, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember?
That the evolution of electoral reforms in India is an ongoing process, a testament to the nation's unwavering commitment to strengthening its democratic foundations. It's a journey that demands our attention, our participation, and a willingness to adapt to new challenges.
Beautifully said. Whether you're studying for the UPSC or just a citizen who cares about India's democracy, understanding and being a part of this evolution is essential, because ultimately the power rests with the people. Stay informed, get involved, and hold your elected officials accountable. That's how we build a better democracy, a more vibrant democracy.
And never forget the power of your vote. Your voice matters. Every vote counts.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through the world of India's electoral reforms. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and those votes casting.